I never thought my life could change in a single day. One moment I was living a peaceful life with my husband, the love of my life, enjoying quiet mornings in our home, the smell of his coffee brewing, the sound of him humming in the kitchen. We had built a life together, filled with laughter, memories, and the kind of love that feels unshakable. I thought we had years left, decades even, to enjoy what we had created. Then, suddenly, he was gone. Just like that. The world I knew shattered. The house that had been our sanctuary became a cold, empty place, echoing with silence. And that's when the nightmare truly began. I learned that my daughter, the one I had raised, inherited everything. Our home and $44 million. At first I was in shock, not just at her inheritance, but at the way she looked at me afterward, as if I no longer belonged anywhere in the world. The words she said will haunt me forever. Find somewhere else to die. You're useless now. I sat there, stunned, my heart breaking, not just for myself, but for the betrayal I couldn't comprehend. And yet, even in that moment of despair, I knew there was more to this story. Something she hadn't realized. The lawyer called a few days later, and I'll never forget the sound of his laughter when he said, "Did you even read the will?" That was when my daughter went pale, and I knew that the tables were about to turn. I remember the day my world turned upside down like it was yesterday. After my husband passed away, I thought I would find comfort in my daughter's presence, in the family we had built together. I believed she would understand the grief, the emptiness, the hollow feeling that follows when someone you love more than life itself is suddenly gone. But I couldn't have been more wrong. The moment she stepped into our home, there was a coldness in her eyes I had never seen before. She wasn't here to console me, to offer an embrace, to hold my hand and say, "Mom, we'll get through this together." No. She was here with a glint of something else, something I could not yet name. When the lawyer handed her the documents, our house, the investments, the $44 million, her expression shifted. I had expected shock, maybe gratitude, perhaps even tears. But what I saw instead was a sharp, almost predatory excitement, like she had been waiting for this day longer than she let on. She barely glanced at me, as if I were invisible, as if my existence no longer mattered in the world she was about to claim as her own. I remember standing there, clutching my late husband's picture, the one where he smiled so warmly at the camera, oblivious to the storm that was about to descend. My daughter turned toward me, her voice cold, slicing through the air like ice. "Find somewhere else to die. You're useless now." Those words hit me harder than any grief I had ever felt. I couldn't breathe for a moment. I felt as though someone had punched me square in the chest, knocking all the air from my lungs, leaving me gasping in disbelief. My own daughter, the little girl I had nurtured, fed, loved through every scraped knee, every heartbreak, every late-night fear, had become a stranger. I wanted to cry, to scream, to throw myself on the floor and let the pain consume me. But I didn't. For a moment, I just stood there, stunned, my mind racing, my heart breaking in ways I didn't know were possible. I felt a strange mixture of shock, sadness, and disbelief, swirling together so violently that I could hardly recognize my own reflection in the mirror across the room. Part of me wanted to lash out, to shout at her for the cruelty, to remind her of everything I had done, everything I had sacrificed, everything I had endured for this family. But then another part, perhaps the wiser, quieter part, took over. It whispered to me that anger in this moment would only make her victory complete, that reacting in haste, showing weakness, would give her the satisfaction she clearly craved. So I stayed calm. I stayed quiet. I didn't even move. I let her words hang in the air, heavy and bitter, like smoke that chokes the lungs but cannot be touched. I refused to feed the fire she had started. And in that quiet, in that stillness, I realized something important. I was not powerless. My daughter may have inherited everything, but she had not inherited my mind, my dignity, or my resolve. I remember watching her pace through the living room, her hands clutching the papers like they were trophies, her voice dripping with entitlement as she spoke to the lawyer about what she intended to do next. Every sentence, every gesture was designed to remind me of my supposed uselessness. She assumed she had already won, that the battle was over before it had even begun. And yet, beneath the fear and heartbreak, a small ember of determination sparked within me. It was faint at first, barely noticeable against the overwhelming tide of betrayal. But it was there, and I knew it would grow. I knew that even though she had cast me aside, even though she had treated me as though I were disposable, I still had something she could never take from me. My patience, my clarity, and the knowledge of the truth that would soon reveal itself. In those moments of silence, I replayed every memory with her. The laughter, the tears, the milestones we had shared. It pained me deeply to realize how quickly she had discarded all of it, how easily she had decided that love and respect were optional. And yet, I forced myself to breathe, to compose myself, to remind myself that this was only the beginning. I stood in the hallway, holding my late husband's picture to my chest, feeling both small and infinitely strong at the same time. She didn't notice me, didn't acknowledge me, but that didn't matter. I didn't need her recognition or her approval. I only needed to remain vigilant, to hold on to my dignity, and to wait for the right moment. Because I had learned long ago that revenge or justice is far sweeter when it is measured, deliberate, and perfectly timed. Even as she strutted through the house, laughing to herself at her victory, I felt no anger, at least not outwardly. Inside, there was a storm, yes, a whirlwind of hurt and betrayal, but it was controlled, harnessed. And in that control, I found clarity. I began to see the cracks in her arrogance, the impatience in her strategy, the mistakes she would make because she assumed she had already won. My heart was heavy, my spirit bruised, but my mind was sharp. I realized that her words, cruel and unthinkable as they were, had not broken me. They had awakened something within me, something that would not be silenced, something that would not yield to injustice or greed. And as I stood there, quietly, while she celebrated her illusory triumph, I made a silent promise to myself. I would not beg. I would not cry. I would not plead. I would wait. I would watch. And when the time came, she would see that true power does not always lie in money, titles, or inheritance. It lies in patience, intelligence, and the ability to remain unshaken when the world tries to destroy you. The betrayal was sharp, painful, and unforgettable. But in that pain, I found the first spark of my own quiet strength. I knew that no words of cruelty, no display of entitlement, could ever take that from me. And as I stood there, trembling slightly but composed, I realized that this was only the beginning of a story that would not end the way she thought it would. Because while she thought she had cast me aside forever, she didn't know that I had already begun to turn the tide, and that the very inheritance she flaunted with such pride would one day reveal a truth she had completely overlooked. I breathed slowly, allowing the shock and heartbreak to settle into a cold, controlled awareness. Every step she took, every word she spoke was being catalogued in my mind. And even in that dark, painful moment, I felt a strange sense of anticipation. For though she had inherited the house, the money, and the illusion of victory, the story was far from over. And I, quietly, would be ready. Being forced out of the only home I had ever known was like losing my very soul. The walls that had once held our laughter, our celebrations, our quiet evenings together, now felt hollow, cold, and unfamiliar. I walked through each room one last time, my fingers brushing along surfaces that had known the touch of love and memory. Each step felt surreal, as if I were walking in someone else's life. Someone who had never known joy, comfort, or family. I remember the moment the realization hit. This wasn't temporary. This wasn't a misunderstanding that could be patched over. My daughter had made it abundantly clear. I no longer belonged. The words she had spoken, "Find somewhere else to die, you're useless now," echoed in my mind like a cruel mantra, repeating, gnawing at the edges of my composure. The world I thought I understood had shifted violently under my feet, leaving me suspended in a reality I was unprepared for. At first, the search for shelter was frantic. I tried calling friends, distant relatives, even neighbors, but the humiliation clung to me like a heavy coat. Each attempt to explain my situation was met with sympathetic eyes, hesitant words, and polite distance. There was no easy refuge, no place to quietly grieve without feeling like an intruder, an unwelcome guest in the lives of those who had their own struggles. I spent nights in small motels, the fluorescent lights harsh and unforgiving. The silence was deafening, and sleep became a luxury my mind refused to allow. I would lie awake staring at the ceiling, replaying the scene over and over. The cruelty in her eyes, the triumph in her tone, the way she had made me feel invisible. Anger simmered beneath the surface, a steady flame I could neither extinguish nor fully release. I did not scream. I did not throw things. I did not confront anyone. Instead, I let the anger sit quietly, like a weight pressing against my chest, sharpening my awareness, honing my focus. There were moments of overwhelming grief, tears that I allowed to fall only when I was alone, hidden from prying eyes. I mourned not only the loss of my husband, but the loss of the family bond I thought was unbreakable. Every memory felt tainted, every corner of my life shadowed by betrayal. Yet even in my sorrow, there was a thread of resilience, a quiet determination that refused to be extinguished. During the day, I would wander the streets, walking past the shops, the parks, the places I had once frequented with my husband and daughter. Everywhere I looked, there were reminders of what I had lost. Yet these reminders also fueled a subtle planning, a quiet plotting that I could not yet articulate. Each step became an exercise in patience, each passing hour a reminder that impulsive action would only play into her hands. I began to map the days, the opportunities, the small advantages she might overlook in her rush to claim victory. I refused to let humiliation define me, even when neighbors glanced at me with pity, even when strangers whispered or stared. I held my head high. My dignity was mine to keep, untouched by her greed, unbroken by her cruelty. I learned to move through spaces invisibly yet deliberately, absorbing the world without allowing it to absorb me. I became a shadow in plain sight, listening, watching, waiting. In these moments, subtle lessons emerged. I realized that power is not always loud, and revenge is not always immediate. True strength is measured not in impulsive confrontation, but in strategic patience. I would not beg. I would not plead. I would not allow her to see the fear or desperation I felt. Instead, I would store it, channel it, and let it guide my actions when the moment was right. There were days when despair threatened to swallow me whole. The loneliness was palpable, a heavy cloak that pressed against my chest, making even small tasks feel monumental. I would sit in my temporary quarters, staring at the bare walls, and question everything. Had I raised my daughter wrong? Had I somehow failed to instill gratitude or empathy? But then I would remember the man I had loved, the life we had built, and the principles we had lived by. I would remember that her cruelty reflected her own flaws, not my failures. And so I carried on. I took small steps each day, buying groceries, paying for my modest accommodations, navigating the world as someone invisible yet entirely present. Each step reinforced my sense of self, each act of quiet independence a reaffirmation of my worth. I refused to let her actions define me, and in doing so, I discovered a strength I had never fully acknowledged within myself. Even as anger and grief simmered beneath the surface, they were tempered by reason. I began to formulate plans, not out of malice alone, but out of necessity. I would need patience. I would need observation. I would need to wait for the exact moment when her arrogance, her haste, and her ignorance of the law would reveal the cracks in her strategy. I could not rush, for impulsive actions would only strengthen her illusion of control. Each night I would review the documents I had managed to glimpse: the will, the inheritance papers, the legal correspondences. I began to notice details she overlooked, clauses she misread, and provisions she seemed to have dismissed in her excitement. These small revelations were sparks of hope, tiny beacons in the darkness that reminded me that justice might still be possible, that the truth might still prevail. My life outside the house was lonely and challenging, but it was also instructive. I learned to navigate a world that had suddenly turned hostile, to move with quiet purpose through spaces where I was unwelcome, to endure humiliation without surrendering my dignity. I realized that patience was not weakness, and silence was not submission. They were tools, weapons even, that I could wield in the pursuit of a far greater victory. I remember sitting on the park bench one evening, watching families walk by, couples laughing, children playing, and feeling a pang of longing and sorrow. I let the tears fall then, quietly, privately, but I also let myself imagine the day when the tables would turn, when the truth would shine so brightly that no one could ignore it. And in that imagining, in that silent hope, I began to feel a strange sense of empowerment. Though I was forced out of my home, though I was humiliated, though grief and anger coiled around me like shadows, I refused to let these forces define me. I held my head high, nurtured my resolve, and let the embers of patience grow into a fire that would, in time, illuminate the full story. And so, I waited. I observed. I endured. I planned. And in that waiting, I discovered that true dignity is not a gift granted by others. It is claimed in silence, nurtured in adversity, and revealed when the moment is right. The betrayal had driven me from my home, but it had not broken me. In fact, it had awakened a strength I had never fully recognized, the quiet power of resilience, patience, and dignity in the face of unimaginable cruelty. And though my daughter believed she had won, she had no idea that the seeds of her undoing were already planted, quietly, deliberately, in the mind of the woman she had tried to discard. After being forced out of the home I had shared with my late husband, I quickly realized that patience would be my greatest ally. The world had shifted beneath my feet, but I refused to be rushed into action by anger or despair. Every word my daughter had spoken, every gesture of cruelty, had been carefully catalogued in my mind. And yet, I did not confront her. I did not shout. I did not demand justice immediately. I waited. Waiting was difficult, almost excruciating. Each day felt like a test of endurance. I watched my daughter from afar, noting her confidence, her growing arrogance, her assumption that victory was entirely hers. But I had learned over the years that arrogance blinds the clever, and in her haste she would inevitably make mistakes. My job was to observe, to gather, to wait until the perfect moment presented itself. In the quiet solitude of my temporary home, I reflected on the inheritance and my late husband's intentions. He had been a careful man, deliberate, fair-minded, and thoughtful in ways that were often subtle. The house and the $44 million were not merely assets. They were symbols of a lifetime of work, love, and careful planning. My husband had trusted my daughter to handle the inheritance responsibly, yes, but he had also put safeguards in place, clauses in the will that would ensure fairness and accountability. And he had, perhaps unknowingly, equipped me with the knowledge to hold those safeguards in motion. I recalled late nights sitting together with him, discussing finances, family obligations, and the future. He had always been cautious, always reminding me that greed can cloud judgment and that the unexpected is often overlooked. As I replayed these memories, I realized that my daughter's arrogance was setting her up for failure. She had inherited wealth and property, yes, But she had not inherited wisdom, foresight, or a thorough understanding of the very documents she had so carelessly claimed. Even in my displacement, even as I lived in motels and slept on borrowed couches, I found small victories. Each misstep she made, each moment of overconfidence was a clue. She misread a clause here, misinterpreted a line there. She assumed certain accounts were hers outright, disregarding the specifics outlined in the will. And with each of these observations, a subtle sense of hope grew inside me. My daughter's triumph was not complete. She had built a castle on sand, and I could see the foundation beginning to crumble. There were moments of quiet satisfaction, small victories that gave me strength. A letter misfiled, a bank official who hesitated before releasing funds, a neighbor who hesitated when she tried to assert control over property I had long managed. These tiny cracks in her confidence were like breadcrumbs leading me toward the greater truth. I did not celebrate loudly. I did not gloat. I simply noted them, storing each one in the recesses of my mind, weaving them into a tapestry of patience and strategy. Waiting required discipline. I reminded myself every day that true power is not in immediate action, but in preparation. I could have confronted her, demanded restitution, or publicly challenged her actions. But doing so would have given her the satisfaction of knowing she had provoked me. It would have tipped my hand, revealing my awareness and my strength too soon. And I knew better. I had learned that the silent, observant approach yields results far sweeter than the impulsive. During these long days, I allowed myself to reflect on what my husband would have wanted. He had always emphasized fairness, integrity, and patience. In watching my daughter, I began to understand that this was a test, not just of her character, but of mine as well. The betrayal had been painful, yes, but it was also an opportunity to honor my husband's memory by acting with composure, intelligence, and quiet resolve. I became keenly aware of the lessons he had instilled in me over a lifetime, and I resolved to follow them to the letter. I would not act out of anger. I would not act out of fear. And I would not act rashly. Instead, I waited for the perfect moment, for the precise opportunity when the truth would be revealed, when the will would speak louder than her arrogance. Each day of waiting strengthened my resolve, sharpened my focus, and heightened my awareness. I became almost surgical in my observation, noting the subtle ways in which she assumed control, the missteps that would soon become her undoing. As I waited, I revisited the will in my mind, mentally reviewing each clause, each provision, each detail that my daughter had clearly overlooked. I remembered the lawyer explaining the nuances to me years earlier, the careful wording my husband had chosen to ensure fairness. And in this reflection, I realized that the moment of revelation would not come from confrontation or anger. It would come from understanding, clarity, and timing. The law would speak, and when it did, my daughter would finally see the consequences of her haste and greed. There were moments when I felt despair creeping in, when the weight of betrayal and displacement threatened to overwhelm me. But I quickly reminded myself that these feelings were temporary and that my purpose was not to indulge in grief, but to channel it. Each pang of sadness, each flicker of anger, became fuel for the strategy I was quietly developing. I transformed my emotional turmoil into clarity, my humiliation into observation, my grief into patience. During these days, I also became keenly aware of the world around me. I listened to conversations, observed interactions, and paid attention to details my daughter would dismiss as trivial. These observations gave me insight into her personality, her impatience, and her blind spots. Every slip of pride, every miscalculated move, became a clue that I carefully filed away for the future. And then, there was the lawyer. I had not spoken to him directly yet, but I sensed that his involvement would be pivotal. His expertise, his understanding of the will, and his impartiality would serve as the instrument through which justice could be revealed. I imagined the moment he would call, The subtle inflection in his voice that would alert me to the truth. The words that would make my daughter pale with the realization of her misjudgment. The anticipation of that moment became a quiet thrill, a controlled excitement that I allowed to simmer just beneath the surface. I spent countless hours in quiet reflection, pacing the small spaces of my temporary quarters, reviewing my memories of my husband, my life, and my daughter. I replayed conversations, considered possibilities, and mentally rehearsed the patience I would need to maintain. Each hour of waiting was a lesson in discipline, each day an exercise in restraint. I became a master of observation, a silent strategist preparing for the inevitable moment when the truth would emerge. Even as the days stretched into weeks, I held on to my quiet dignity. I refused to let anyone, neighbor, stranger, or even my daughter, see the cracks in my composure. I smiled when necessary, nodded politely, and continued with the routines of daily life as if nothing had changed, while in reality I was meticulously preparing for the culmination of this ordeal. The patience I exercised was not passive. It was active, deliberate, and purposeful. And so I waited. I observed, I reflected. I planned. Each misstep my daughter made, each assumption she held about the inheritance, became a piece of the puzzle I was quietly assembling. I knew the lawyer's call would come, and I knew that when it did, the revelation would be irreversible. The suspense was almost unbearable, yet it was under my control. I was calm, poised, and ready, because while my daughter believed she had won, she had overlooked the most important element. I had not only survived her cruelty, I had learned, observed, and prepared. I had turned my grief into strategy, my humiliation into vigilance, my anger into precision. And when the right moment arrived, I would ensure that the truth and justice would finally prevail. The day finally came. After weeks of waiting, observing, and quietly preparing, the pivotal moment arrived. I remember it with crystal clarity. My phone rang, and it was the lawyer. I felt a strange mixture of anticipation, nervousness, and a quiet thrill I had not experienced since my husband's passing. I knew, deep in my bones, that the call I was about to receive would change everything. The lawyer's voice came through the line, warm yet tinged with amusement. I could hear the slight chuckle, almost imperceptible at first, but growing as he spoke. I paused, sensing that his laughter was not casual. It was deliberate, calculated. And then the words fell, slowly and deliberately, like a gavel striking truth into place. "Did you even read the will?" he asked. The simplicity of the question struck me like a lightning bolt. I felt my chest tighten, my breath catch, and for a fleeting moment, I allowed myself a small smile. The lawyer continued, explaining with calm clarity the precise details of my late husband's intentions, the clauses that my daughter had completely overlooked, the specific language that ensured fairness and revealed her assumptions to be entirely mistaken. I could hear the disbelief in his tone, the subtle amusement at my daughter's oversight. And then he detailed the provisions, the trusts, the stipulations, the inheritance structures. Everything my daughter had assumed was hers outright, and everything she had misinterpreted. It was all there, carefully laid out, exactly as my husband had intended. I imagined my daughter's reaction, and in that moment, I knew she was pale. I could see her standing in the living room of the house she believed she now owned, clutching the papers in her hand, her face drained of color. Panic was creeping in, slowly but surely, like a shadow spreading across the room. She had thought she had everything, control, wealth, superiority, but now the foundation she had relied on was crumbling beneath her feet. The lawyer contended, his tone measured, almost enjoying the moment without being unkind. He detailed the consequences of misreading the will, the legal obligations she had ignored, and the portions of the inheritance that were designated in ways she had failed to comprehend. Every word was a nail in the coffin of her assumed victory. I felt a rush of emotions, vindication, relief, and a quiet joy that had nothing to do with malice. This was not about gloating. This was about justice, about the truth finally surfacing after a long, painful period of betrayal and uncertainty. The wait had been worth it, the patience had been necessary, and the moment of revelation was intoxicating in its clarity. Even as I absorbed the details, I thought about my daughter's panic. The shock must have been overwhelming. Her mind racing, heart pounding, eyes wide, realizing she had misread, misunderstood, and miscalculated every step she had taken. I imagined her guilt and fear intertwining, each emotion amplifying the other, leaving her frozen, speechless, and uncertain of how to respond. And yet, even in the midst of her panic, I remained composed. I did not celebrate, I did not interrupt. I simply listened, taking in every word, every nuance of the lawyer's explanation. I allowed the reality of the situation to settle in fully, letting the tables turn in silence while the consequences unfolded. The lawyer then walked me through what this meant for her actions. Her attempts to assert control, to exclude me, to claim ownership, all of it had been premature, ill-informed, and ultimately futile. She had assumed victory, but victory is fragile when built on misunderstanding. And now the scales of justice were tipping back toward the balance my husband had intended. I could almost see her scrambling, the panic intensifying with every realization. The room she had once viewed as her kingdom suddenly felt smaller, constricting, and unfamiliar. Every confident move she had made in the weeks following my husband's death now seemed reckless, naive, and short-sighted. And I knew that the moment she would understand the full impact of her oversight, she would be undone. Not by confrontation, but by the quiet, unwavering truth of the law and the intentions my husband had set forth. The emotional impact of the call was profound. I felt the weight of weeks of suffering lift slightly, replaced by a controlled exhilaration. The betrayal, the humiliation, and the grief I had endured were finally met with an outcome that reflected fairness, dignity, and justice. I allowed myself to breathe deeply, feeling the tension in my shoulders ease as clarity replaced confusion. Even as I remained composed, I could sense the shift in power. My daughter, who had assumed she controlled everything, was now reacting to information she had ignored, underestimated, or failed to notice. The arrogance that had once defined her actions was now giving way to uncertainty, the kind that can unravel even the most confident of plans. I felt no gloating, only the quiet satisfaction of knowing that truth has a way of prevailing, often when least expected. I could hear the lawyer's patience as he detailed how the legal mechanisms would play out, how her misinterpretations would correct themselves, and how the rightful distribution of assets and responsibilities would be enforced. The tables had indeed begun to turn. The arrogance, entitlement, and cruelty that she had wielded so freely now had a counterforce she could neither anticipate nor control. Her panic, I imagined, was compounded by the realization that her actions had consequences she had not foreseen. The fear in her eyes, the trembling of her hands, the sudden awareness that she had acted recklessly. All of it was exactly as it should be. She had believed she could erase me, silence me, and claim victory, but she had underestimated patience, preparation, and the enduring clarity of truth. And through it all, I remained composed. I did not need to speak, to act, or to assert dominance. The lawyer's call, his explanation, and her realization were enough. The moment of revelation unfolded without my interference, yet it was shaped entirely by the groundwork I had laid through patience, observation, and quiet resilience. I reflected on the journey that had led to this point. Weeks of careful observation, nights spent in reflection, days spent noting small mistakes. All of it culminated in this pivotal moment. The betrayal that had once felt insurmountable was now being corrected by the deliberate mechanisms my husband had set in motion and by the vigilance I had maintained in his absence. And in that moment, I felt a quiet empowerment that was deeper than any triumph of money or property. This was not revenge in the petty sense. This was justice. This was the restoration of balance. My daughter's panic and shock were merely the outward signs of a truth that had been quietly asserting itself all along. The tables had turned. The power she had assumed was hers by default was now shifting, recalibrating, and revealing the consequences of her haste and arrogance. I could sense her scrambling mentally, trying to understand where she had gone wrong, but the answers were already in motion. The mechanisms of law, fairness, and foresight were correcting the course she had disrupted. And even as she felt panic, guilt, and shock, I felt calm. I felt steady. I felt the satisfaction of knowing that patience, dignity, and clarity can achieve what anger and impulsiveness never can. The lawyer's laughter, subtle as it was, underscored the magnitude of the situation. This was not about me winning. It was about truth asserting itself, about justice being realized. I could almost see her realization spreading, the color draining from her face, the weight of her mistakes pressing down. And in that precise moment, I knew that the quiet strength I had maintained throughout this ordeal was finally paying off. Her arrogance, her cruelty, her sense of entitlement, all of it was meeting consequences she had not anticipated. I leaned back, letting the words sink in, allowing the reality of the situation to fully take shape. My daughter had assumed she could control everything, but the truth, finally revealed, was a force beyond her comprehension. The tables had turned, the balance was shifting, and the course of events she had so carelessly tried to manipulate was now moving toward justice. And in that moment, I felt a calm satisfaction, a quiet triumph that needed no words. The betrayal had been profound, but the revelation, the turning of the tide, and the restoration of fairness were even more profound. I had endured, I had observed, and now the truth was asserting itself exactly as it should. The moment of truth had arrived, and I could see the ripples of its impact in my daughter's reaction. The panic, confusion, and disbelief I had anticipated were just the beginning. Her confident demeanor, the arrogance that had defined her every move since inheriting the house and the $44 million, had crumbled completely. For the first time, she was silent, unsure, stripped of the certainty she had once wielded like a weapon. I could almost see her pacing the room, her hands trembling, eyes darting to the papers in front of her. Every clause, every line she had ignored or misread, now revealed the magnitude of her misjudgment. The lawyer's explanation had undone the illusion of control she had carried for weeks. She had assumed victory, yet reality now stared back at her, unyielding and undeniable. Her shock was palpable. I imagined her voice trembling as she tried to speak, to ask questions, to reclaim some semblance of authority, but the answers were already clear. The inheritance she had believed was entirely hers was subject to provisions she had failed to understand, protections my husband had wisely built in, and her ignorance had left her exposed. The immediate consequences were unavoidable. She could no longer manipulate or control the situation through arrogance or bluster. I watched quietly, as I had throughout this ordeal, feeling a profound sense of calm. My daughter's dismay was not something I sought to gloat over. It was the natural result of her missteps. The law, fairness, and the deliberate wisdom my husband had embedded in his will were asserting themselves, correcting the imbalance she had created. This was not revenge in the petty sense. This was justice in its purest form. As the reality of her misinterpretation sank in, I noticed a subtle shift in her demeanor. She went from panic to disbelief, then to a kind of helplessness. She was forced to confront not just the consequences of her actions, but the truth of what she had ignored. Patience, respect, and understanding cannot be bypassed by greed or entitlement. The house, the money, the inheritance, All of it had been mismanaged, at least in her mind, and the repercussions were immediate. I allowed myself a moment to reflect on my own journey. Weeks of being forced out, of living in uncertainty, of enduring humiliation and betrayal, had been challenging beyond words. And yet, in all of it, I had maintained my composure. I had stayed quiet, observed, and planned. My patience had become a shield, my dignity an anchor, and my quiet strength a weapon more powerful than any confrontation could ever be. In the silence of her realization, I felt a quiet satisfaction, not pride in her suffering, but in seeing the principles of fairness and truth restored. The emotional satisfaction was profound. It was not a fleeting pleasure. It was the deep, enduring sense of rightness that comes when justice prevails. I had not acted rashly or vindictively. I had allowed the natural consequences of her actions to unfold, guided by patience, observation, and an unwavering commitment to composure. I reflected on what this experience had taught me. Betrayal, cruelty, and greed are formidable challenges, but they are not insurmountable. They can be met with strategy, calm, and dignity. I had endured humiliation, faced grief and anger, and yet I emerged with a clarity that allowed me to act when the moment was right. My daughter had assumed she could erase me, dismiss me, and claim victory, but she had underestimated the quiet strength that comes from experience, patience, and a clear mind. As the lawyer continued to explain the details, I realized that my composure had amplified the impact of the revelation. Had I reacted impulsively, shouted, cried, or demanded restitution, her realization would have been less profound. But by waiting, by observing, and by holding my dignity intact, I allowed the consequences of her actions to unfold naturally. This was a lesson in restraint, in strategic patience, and in the power of quiet strength. The immediate consequences for my daughter were significant. She had to confront the reality that her assumptions about the inheritance were wrong. She could no longer act with impunity, and her previous actions, her cruelty, her disregard, her dismissal of my worth, had tangible repercussions. Her confidence had been shattered, replaced by fear, guilt, and an understanding that entitlement does not equate to true control. I allowed myself to imagine the future unfolding from this moment. She would need to navigate the reality she had overlooked, and I would be prepared, composed, and dignified, ready to respond with fairness rather than malice. The power dynamics had shifted, but the change was not born of vengeance. It was born of justice, patience, and adherence to truth. Through this entire experience, I had learned to value patience above impulse, observation above reaction, and composure above anger. These qualities had allowed me to navigate a deeply painful betrayal with grace and intelligence. They had given me the power to turn the tables not through confrontation, but through strategy, insight, and an unwavering commitment to fairness. As I looked forward, I knew the story would continue to unfold. The consequences my daughter faced were real, and the lessons she would learn would be lasting. I felt a sense of closure, not because I had sought to punish her, but because the principles of truth and justice had been restored. My dignity, patience, and quiet strength had been validated in the most profound way. And in that validation, I found peace. The betrayal that had once seemed insurmountable had been met with clarity, patience, and strategic action. The cruelty, arrogance, and disregard for fairness that my daughter had displayed had been countered not with anger, but with composure and careful observation. And the result was a resolution that felt right, fair, and deeply satisfying. I realized that life often presents challenges that test our patience, dignity, and resilience. Betrayal can be crushing, cruelty can feel unbearable, and injustice can seem overwhelming. But these trials are not insurmountable. They can be met with strategic patience, quiet strength, and unwavering composure. And when the moment is right, The consequences of actions, both good and ill, will reveal themselves. As I reflected on the weeks that had passed, I felt a sense of empowerment and gratitude. Empowerment for having navigated a deeply painful ordeal with dignity, and gratitude for the lessons it had taught me about patience, strategy, and the quiet power of composure. I had endured humiliation, betrayal, and grief, yet emerged stronger, wiser, and more aware of the power of measured action. The moral of the story became clear to me. Even the deepest betrayal can be overcome with intelligence, patience, and a commitment to dignity. One does not need to retaliate with malice or anger. The most profound victories are those achieved with composure, observation, and strategic action. Justice does not always arrive loudly or immediately, but when it does, its impact is undeniable. I allowed myself a final reflection. My daughter's reaction, her panic, her realization, these were the natural results of her haste and arrogance. My journey, my patience, and my quiet strength had ensured that fairness was restored, not through confrontation, but through careful observation, strategic restraint, and adherence to truth. And in that restoration, I found a profound sense of satisfaction. Not a fleeting triumph, not a shallow victory, but a deep, enduring recognition that composure, patience, and dignity are more powerful than anger, entitlement, or cruelty. The tables had turned completely. The injustice, the betrayal, and the cruelty had met their rightful consequences. And I, quietly, had reclaimed not only my dignity, but the satisfaction of seeing fairness restored. In that quiet victory, I understood the true meaning of strength, patience, and the enduring power of strategic composure. Looking back on everything that happened, the betrayal, the heartbreak, and the disbelief, I realized that the most important lessons are not about money or property. They are about patience, dignity, and the quiet strength we carry even in the darkest moments. My daughter's actions were cruel and shocking, yet they taught me something invaluable. Composure in the face of injustice is far more powerful than anger or retaliation. To anyone watching this story, remember, family can sometimes disappoint, and betrayal can feel unbearable. But respect, both giving it and maintaining it for yourself, is never wasted. Staying calm, observing carefully, and planning thoughtfully can turn even the deepest challenges into moments of clarity and justice. At the end of the day, true power is not in yelling, demanding, or lashing out. It's in maintaining your integrity, holding your head high, and letting the truth reveal itself at the right time. No one can take away your strength unless you allow it. So, even when life hurts and betrayal stings, trust in your patience, trust in your dignity, and trust that composure can change everything. Because in the quiet, steadfast moments, you discover the power to rise, restore, and prevail, no matter what has been taken from you.